Welcome back to The Haunted Lore, where we explore the darkest corners of documented hauntings, urban legends, and true crime through the lens of history. Today we're traveling to 1970s Germany to examine one of the most controversial and tragic cases in modern exorcism history. The story we're about to explore raises profound questions about faith, mental health, and the dangerous intersection between religious belief and medical treatment. It's the case of Anneliese Michel, a young German woman whose death in 1976 sparked international debate and forever changed how we view possession, exorcism, and the responsibility of those who claim to combat supernatural forces. This is a story that demands we approach it with both respect for the tragic loss of life and a critical examination of the events that led to that loss. So settle in as we delve into the haunting tale of Anneliese Michel and the 67 exorcisms that ultimately claimed her life. What led a devout Catholic girl down such a dark path? Anneliese Michel was born on September 21, 1952, in Labelfing, Bavaria, into a deeply Catholic family. Her parents, Joseph and Anna Michel, raised their 4 daughters in an environment where religious devotion wasn't just encouraged, it was the foundation of daily life. The Michel family attended Mass regularly, observed Catholic traditions strictly, and lived by the moral codes that their faith prescribed. Bavaria itself provided the perfect backdrop for such religious intensity. This region of Germany had remained steadfastly Catholic even as other parts of the country embraced Protestantism or secularism. The landscape was dotted with centuries-old churches, monasteries, and religious shrines. Folk traditions blended seamlessly with Catholic doctrine, creating a culture where the supernatural wasn't questioned, but rather accepted as part of God's mysterious plan. Anneliese grew up as what many would consider the ideal Catholic daughter. She was quiet, studious, and deeply committed to her faith. Teachers described her as intelligent and conscientious, someone who took her religious education seriously. She participated in church activities, helped with younger children in religious programs, and seemed destined for a life that would honor both her family and her faith. However, beneath this picture of religious devotion, the Michel family carried a burden of shame that would profoundly impact their worldview. Anna Michel had given birth to an illegitimate daughter before marrying Joseph, a fact that in 1950s Catholic Bavaria carried enormous social stigma. This daughter had died young, and Anna interpreted this tragedy through the lens of divine punishment. She believed that God was judging their family for her past sins, a belief that would color how the family interpreted future hardships. This background of religious intensity, mixed with guilt and shame, created an atmosphere where supernatural explanations for misfortune weren't just possible, they were expected. When troubles came to the Michel household, the family's first instinct wasn't to seek rational explanations, but to examine their spiritual standing before God. When did normal teenage struggles become something more sinister? The year 1968 marked the beginning of what would become Anneliese Michel's descent into tragedy, though initially her symptoms seemed relatively mundane. At 16, she began experiencing what doctors would later diagnose as temporal lobe epilepsy. The seizures started small, brief moments of disorientation, strange smells that weren't there, and episodes where she would simply stare blankly into space. For a teenage girl trying to navigate the already complex world of adolescence, these episodes were embarrassing and frightening. Anneliese would suddenly freeze during conversations, her eyes would glaze over, and she would remain unresponsive for several minutes. When these episodes ended, she often had no memory of what had occurred, leaving her confused and increasingly anxious about when the next one might happen. The medical community in the 1960s in Germany was beginning to understand epilepsy better, but treatment options remained limited. Doctors prescribed anticonvulsant medications, but these early drugs came with significant side effects. Anneliese experienced drowsiness, difficulty concentrating, and mood changes that made her academic and social life even more challenging. By 1970, her condition had worsened. The seizures became more frequent and more severe. She would sometimes bite her tongue during episodes, leaving her mouth bloody. The medications weren't controlling her symptoms effectively, and doctors began adjusting dosages and trying different combinations of drugs. This trial-and-error approach left Anneliese feeling like a medical experiment rather than a person deserving care and understanding. What made these medical challenges particularly difficult for the Michel family was their interpretation of illness through a religious lens. In their worldview, physical ailments weren't just medical problems. They were often seen as spiritual tests or, worse, spiritual attacks. As Anneliese's condition worsened, her family began to wonder whether medicine alone could address what they were witnessing. The turning point came when Anneliese began reporting experiences that went beyond typical epileptic symptoms. She claimed to see demonic faces during her seizures, described hearing voices that no one else could hear, and reported overwhelming feelings of dread and evil presence. These reports aligned disturbingly well with Catholic teachings about demonic influence, setting the stage for a tragic misinterpretation of a young woman's medical condition. How did medical treatment transform into spiritual warfare? The transition from medical treatment to religious intervention didn't happen overnight. Instead, it developed gradually as Anneliese's symptoms evolved and her family's frustration with conventional medicine grew. By 1973, 5 years after her initial diagnosis, the young woman's condition had deteriorated significantly despite ongoing medical treatment. Anneliese had enrolled at the University of Würzburg to study education, hoping to become a teacher. However, her seizures made academic life increasingly difficult. She would have episodes during lectures, causing disruption and drawing unwanted attention. The side effects of her medications made it hard to concentrate on her studies, and she began to fall behind academically. More troubling were the behavioral changes that accompanied her worsening condition. Anneliese, once known for her gentle nature and religious devotion, began displaying aggressive behavior during her episodes. She would sometimes lash out physically at family members, using language that shocked her devoutly Catholic parents. She also developed an aversion to religious objects that had once brought her comfort, recoiling from crucifixes and refusing to enter churches. These changes terrified the Michel family, not just because of their daughter's suffering, but because they seemed to align with everything their faith had taught them about demonic possession. In Catholic doctrine, demons were believed to despise holy objects, to speak through their victims in foreign languages or with knowledge they shouldn't possess, and to give their hosts supernatural strength during manifestations. The family's parish priest initially tried to maintain a balance between faith and reason. He acknowledged their concerns, but encouraged them to continue with medical treatment. However, as Anneliese's condition worsened and her behavior became more disturbing, even religious authorities began to question whether they were dealing with a purely medical issue. The breakthrough moment came when Anneliese began speaking in what her family believed were the voices of historical figures. During her episodes, she would claim to be Judas Iscariot, speaking of betraying Christ. She would take on the persona of Adolf Hitler, ranting about his hatred for humanity. Most disturbing to her Catholic family, she would speak as Lucifer himself, blasphemously mocking religious figures and expressing hatred for God. These manifestations convinced the Michel family that their daughter was no longer simply ill, she was possessed. They began seeking religious help while continuing medical treatment, but their focus had clearly shifted from healing Anneliese's body to saving her soul. What drove the church to approve such an extreme measure? The Catholic Church's decision to authorize exorcism in Anneliese Michel's case wasn't made lightly or quickly. The process involved months of observation, consultation, and deliberation among religious authorities who understood the serious implications of their decision. However, several factors ultimately convinced them that supernatural intervention was necessary. Father Ernst Alt, the Michel family's parish priest, had been observing Anneliese's condition for over a year before recommending exorcism. He documented instances where the young woman demonstrated knowledge she shouldn't have possessed, speaking Latin phrases despite never having studied the language extensively, and referencing obscure theological concepts that seemed beyond her education level. During her episodes, she would sometimes predict events that later came to pass, adding to the supernatural interpretation of her condition. The regional bishop, Joseph Stangl, was initially skeptical of the possession claims. The Catholic Church had been moving away from exorcism practices as understanding of mental illness improved, and church leaders were well aware of the potential for scandal if they approved an exorcism that later proved unnecessary. However, the persistence of Anneliese's symptoms, despite years of medical treatment, combined with the increasingly supernatural nature of her manifestations, gradually wore down his resistance. What ultimately convinced church authorities was the apparent failure of medical intervention. Anneliese had been under psychiatric care for years, trying various medications and therapies, yet her condition continued to worsen. Her psychiatrists had diagnosed her with psychosis and severe depression in addition to epilepsy, but their treatments seemed powerless against what the family, and now some clergy members, believed was spiritual attack. The church required strict criteria to be met before approving an exorcism. The possessed individual must speak in languages unknown to them, display knowledge they couldn't have acquired naturally, show supernatural strength, and demonstrate an aversion to sacred objects. In Anneliese's case, church investigators believed they had documented all of these phenomena. In September 1975, Bishop Stangl made the fateful decision to authorize the rite of exorcism. He appointed Father Arnold Renz and Pastor Ernst Alt to perform the ceremonies, giving them permission to conduct the ancient ritual that the church had rarely approved in modern times. This decision would prove to be one of the most controversial in the diocese's history, ultimately leading to legal consequences and a fundamental re-examination of the church's approach to possession cases. Why did 67 exorcisms fail to bring peace? The exorcism sessions began in earnest in September 1975 and would continue for 10 months until Anneliese's death in July 1976. These weren't brief rituals conducted over a few days, but rather an extended spiritual battle that consumed the final year of the young woman's life. The frequency and intensity of these sessions created a hellish existence for Anneliese and her family, transforming their home into what they believed was a battlefield between good and evil. Father Renz and Pastor Alt approached their task with what they considered appropriate seriousness and preparation. They studied the traditional Latin rite of exorcism, consulted with other clergy who had experience in such matters, and prepared themselves spiritually for what they expected to be a prolonged struggle. The ritual itself was ancient, dating back centuries in Catholic tradition, involving prayers, commands to the demons to depart, and the use of holy water and sacred objects. During these sessions, Anneliese's behavior became increasingly extreme. She would writhe on the floor, speaking in the voices that her family and the clergy believed belonged to various demons. She would scream obscenities, make predictions about people's deaths, and demonstrate what appeared to be superhuman strength, requiring multiple adults to restrain her during the most violent episodes. What made these exorcisms particularly harrowing was their duration and frequency. Sessions could last for hours, leaving Anneliese physically exhausted and emotionally drained. As the months progressed, the young woman's physical condition deteriorated dramatically. She lost significant weight, developed wounds from her violent thrashing during sessions, and began refusing food that she claimed the demons wouldn't allow her to consume. The failure of the exorcisms to provide relief created a vicious cycle of intensified efforts. Each unsuccessful session convinced the participants that the demons were particularly strong or numerous, requiring even more aggressive spiritual intervention. The clergy began conducting multiple sessions per week, sometimes daily, believing that their persistent prayers would eventually overwhelm the supernatural forces they were fighting. Audio recordings were made of many sessions, capturing hours of Anneliese's tortured voices and the priest's repeated prayers and commands. These recordings would later become crucial evidence in the legal proceedings that followed her death. But during the exorcisms themselves, they served as documentation of what the participants believed was an epic spiritual battle. As 1976 progressed, it became clear that the exorcisms were not healing Anneliese, but rather contributing to her decline. However, by this point, everyone involved was so committed to the supernatural interpretation of events that they couldn't see medical intervention as anything but abandonment of their spiritual duty to save her soul. What warning signs were ignored in the final months? The last months of Anneliese Michel's life were marked by increasingly obvious signs that she was dying, yet her family and the participating clergy interpreted these symptoms as evidence of intensified demonic activity rather than medical emergency. This tragic misinterpretation would prove fatal, as treatable conditions went unaddressed while spiritual remedies were pursued with ever greater desperation. By early 1976, Anneliese's weight had dropped to dangerously low levels. At her death, she weighed only 68 pounds, a dramatic loss from her normal weight of around 120 pounds. Her family noticed her extreme thinness, but attributed it to the demons preventing her from eating properly. They believed that the supernatural entities inhabiting her body were deliberately starving her as part of their attack on her physical form. Her refusal to eat became more pronounced as the exorcism sessions continued. She would claim that food tasted like excrement or that invisible forces were preventing her from swallowing. Medical professionals would later recognize these as potential symptoms of severe depression and psychosis, conditions that could have been treated with appropriate intervention. However, in the context of the ongoing spiritual battle, these symptoms were seen as confirmation of demonic influence. Anneliese also developed severe dehydration, another life-threatening condition that went unaddressed. She would sometimes go days without consuming adequate fluids, claiming that the demons wouldn't allow her to drink. Her skin became sallow, her eyes sunken, and she exhibited classic signs of malnutrition that should have triggered immediate medical attention. Perhaps most telling were her moments of lucidity between the violent episodes. During these periods, Anneliese would sometimes express fear about her condition and ask for medical help. However, these pleas were often interpreted by her family and the clergy as temporary victories against the demonic forces, moments when her true self could speak before being overwhelmed again by supernatural oppression. The young woman also began experiencing what medical experts would recognize as symptoms of severe electrolyte imbalance and organ failure. She complained of weakness, experienced irregular heartbeat, and had difficulty maintaining body temperature. Her immune system, compromised by malnutrition and stress, left her vulnerable to infections that her weakened body couldn't fight effectively. Even in the final weeks, when Anneliese was clearly dying, the focus remained on spiritual rather than medical intervention. Her family and the participating clergy continued to believe that they were on the verge of a breakthrough, that their prayers and rituals would eventually overcome the demonic forces and restore their daughter and parishioner to health. This misplaced faith would prove tragic as treatable medical conditions progressed to the point of no return. How did a young woman's suffering finally end? The morning of July 1st, 1976, brought the tragic conclusion to Anneliese Michel's ordeal. After months of deteriorating health and countless failed exorcism attempts, the 23-year-old woman's body finally succumbed to the combined effects of malnutrition, dehydration, and the physical trauma of her extended spiritual treatment. Her death would mark not only the end of her suffering, but the beginning of a legal and ethical controversy that continues to resonate decades later. On that final morning, Anneliese was found unconscious in her bedroom by her family. She had grown increasingly weak in the previous days, barely able to walk without assistance and speaking in whispers, rather than the violent outbursts that had characterized her recent episodes. Her family initially interpreted this quietness as a positive sign, believing that the demons were finally weakening under the sustained spiritual assault. When emergency medical personnel arrived at the Michel home, they found a young woman whose body showed the devastating effects of prolonged neglect. Her weight had dropped to levels typically seen in severe famine conditions. Her vital signs were barely detectable, and she exhibited signs of multiple organ failure. Despite immediate medical intervention, Anneliese was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. The autopsy revealed the full extent of her physical deterioration. The official cause of death was listed as starvation and dehydration, but the medical examiner noted evidence of prolonged malnutrition, severe weight loss, and complications related to her epilepsy medication, which had been irregularly administered during the final months of her life. There were also signs of physical trauma consistent with the violent episodes she had experienced during exorcism sessions. What made her death particularly tragic was medical experts' assessment that with proper care, Anneliese's life could have been saved even in the final weeks before her death. Hospitalization, intravenous nutrition, proper medication management, and psychiatric care could have addressed the various medical conditions that ultimately killed her. The focus on spiritual healing had prevented the medical intervention that might have restored her to health. Her final words, recorded during the last exorcism session just days before her death, reflected the confusion and suffering that had characterized her final year. She spoke of being tired, of wanting the voices to stop, and of hoping for peace. These words, captured on audio recordings, would later serve as haunting evidence of a young woman's plea for relief from suffering that those around her misunderstood and misaddressed. The immediate aftermath of her death was marked by shock and disbelief from her family and the participating clergy. They had been so convinced that their spiritual battle would ultimately succeed that Anneliese's death came as a devastating surprise, forcing them to confront the possibility that their interpretation of events had been tragically wrong. What legal reckoning followed this tragedy? The death of Anneliese Michel couldn't be quietly mourned and forgotten. The extreme circumstances surrounding her final months, the controversial decision to perform exorcisms instead of seeking adequate medical care, and the young woman's preventable death demanded legal scrutiny. Within months of her burial, German authorities launched an investigation that would result in one of the most publicized trials involving religious practices and medical negligence in modern German history. The investigation began when medical officials reviewing Anneliese's case determined that her death was preventable and that those responsible for her care had failed in their duty to protect her life. Prosecutor Karl Stuckel took on the case, recognizing both its legal complexity and its broader implications for religious freedom and medical responsibility in modern Germany. 4 individuals were ultimately charged with negligent homicide: Anneliese's parents, Joseph and Anna Michel, and the 2 clergymen who had performed the exorcisms, Father Arnold Renz and Pastor Ernst Alt. The charges allege that by focusing exclusively on spiritual treatment while ignoring obvious medical needs, these 4 individuals had contributed directly to Anneliese's death. The trial, which began in 1978, attracted international attention and became a focal point for debates about religious freedom, medical ethics, and the responsibility of both families and religious authorities when traditional beliefs conflict with modern medical understanding. The courtroom was packed with journalists, religious observers, and members of the public who saw the case as a test of how secular law would address religious practices. The prosecution presented a straightforward case. Anneliese Michel had died of starvation and dehydration while in the care of people who chose spiritual remedies over medical treatment. Expert witnesses testified that proper medical care could have saved her life, that her symptoms were consistent with known psychiatric and neurological conditions, and that the exorcism sessions had likely worsened her physical and mental state. The defense took a more complex approach, arguing that the defendants had acted in good faith according to their religious beliefs and that Anneliese herself had requested the exorcisms while rejecting medical treatment. They presented testimony from religious experts about the reality of demonic possession and argued that the defendants should not be held legally responsible for following their sincere religious convictions. Expert witnesses provided conflicting testimony about Anneliese's condition. Medical professionals testified about epilepsy, psychosis, and the effects of malnutrition, while some religious authorities maintained that supernatural forces had been involved in her case. The trial became, in many ways, a public examination of the conflict between scientific and religious worldviews. The verdict, delivered in April 1978, found all 4 defendants guilty of negligent homicide. However, the court showed some sympathy for their religious motivations, imposing relatively lenient sentences of 6 months in prison, which were suspended, and 3 years of probation. The court acknowledged that the defendants had acted according to their sincere beliefs while still holding them responsible for the fatal consequences of their choices. What legacy did this tragedy leave behind? The case of Anneliese Michel didn't end with the trial's conclusion. Instead, her story became a catalyst for significant changes in how religious institutions, medical professionals, and legal systems approach cases involving the intersection of faith and mental health. The tragedy forced society to confront difficult questions about religious freedom, medical responsibility, and the protection of vulnerable individuals who may be caught between competing worldviews. Within the Catholic Church, the case prompted a major re-examination of exorcism practices and the criteria for approving such rituals. The Vatican issued new guidelines requiring more thorough medical and psychiatric evaluation before any exorcism could be considered. The Church began emphasizing that apparent supernatural phenomena should first be investigated through medical and psychological means, with exorcism considered only as a last resort after all other explanations had been exhausted. The German Catholic Church, in particular, became much more cautious about approving exorcisms. Bishops were required to consult with medical professionals and receive explicit permission from higher church authorities before authorizing any exorcism rituals. The Church also began training clergy to better recognize signs of mental illness and to work cooperatively with medical professionals rather than viewing them as competitors in the healing process. In the medical community, the case highlighted the need for better understanding and treatment of psychiatric conditions that might be interpreted through a religious lens. Mental health professionals began developing more effective approaches for working with religious families who might view psychiatric symptoms as spiritual problems. Cultural competency training began emphasizing the importance of understanding patients' religious worldviews while still providing appropriate medical care. The legal implications of the case also extended far beyond the immediate trial. Courts in various countries began grappling with questions about when religious freedom might conflict with laws requiring adequate care for vulnerable individuals. The case established precedents for holding both family members and religious authorities legally accountable when their actions however well-intentioned, result in preventable harm or death. Media coverage of the case brought international attention to the complex issues surrounding mental illness, religious belief, and medical treatment. The story inspired numerous books, documentaries, and films, though many of these focused more on the sensational aspects of possession and exorcism rather than the underlying tragedy of a young woman's preventable death. Perhaps most importantly, the case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of abandoning medical treatment in favor of exclusively spiritual approaches to serious illness. While not dismissing the importance of faith in healing and comfort, medical professionals and religious leaders began emphasizing the compatibility of spiritual care and medical treatment rather than viewing them as mutually exclusive options. The story of Anneliese Michel remains one of the most tragic and controversial cases in modern religious and medical history. It serves as a stark reminder of what can happen when well-meaning people allow fear and misunderstanding to override compassion and rational care for someone who is suffering. As we conclude today's exploration of this haunting case, we're left with profound questions that extend far beyond the specifics of Anneliese's story. How do we balance respect for religious beliefs with the need to protect vulnerable individuals? When does faith healing cross the line into negligent harm? And how can we ensure that people experiencing mental health crises receive the comprehensive care they need, whether that includes spiritual support, medical treatment, or both? Thank you for joining me on the Haunted Lore podcast as we examined this complex and heartbreaking case. The story of Anneliese Michel offers no easy answers, but it provides crucial lessons about the intersection of faith, medicine, and human responsibility. If today's episode has moved you or made you think, please consider subscribing to The Haunted Lore and sharing our podcast with others who appreciate thoughtful exploration of history's darkest and most mysterious cases. Your support helps us continue bringing you these important stories with the respect and thoroughness they deserve. Next week, we'll be exploring another case where the boundaries between reality and the supernatural become disturbingly blurred. Until then, remember that the most important hauntings aren't always about the dead. Sometimes they're about the living and the choices we make that echo through history long after we're gone. This has been the Haunted Lore podcast. Thank you for listening.